At her father's funeral, my wife was dragged away by fake HOA cops. In front of the church, in front of everyone. Karen stood by, quoting rules like gospel, as if grief needed a permit. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The sun had barely begun to set, casting long golden shadows over the rows of parked cars and black suits clustered near the edge of the church lawn. My wife stood close to me, her eyes red and vacant, fingers clutching the small folded flag she had received just an hour earlier. Her father's casket was still fresh in the ground, his life reduced to a ceremony, a stone, and a silence we weren't yet ready to break. This church wasn't just a building. It was history. He had helped build the East Wing with his own hands back in '87, when funds were short and volunteers scarce. Every brick in that wall, every polished floorboard in the foyer, bore his sweat. Today, the community he'd served came to pay respect. People who hadn't spoken in years reunited to honor him. Neighbors, veterans, kids he used to coach in Little League. Everyone had gathered in quiet mourning. Until she arrived. The sound was so out of place, it felt surreal. Rubber squealing on asphalt, followed by the whir of an electric motor. Heads turned, some instinctively shielding their eyes from the low sun, only to catch sight of a rusted golf cart swerving to a stop near the church entrance. Atop its roof, a makeshift yellow strobe blinked with pathetic urgency, like a child's toy imitating a siren. Karen stepped out as if she owned the town. Her expression was a mixture of self-importance and forced restraint, as though she were trying very hard not to smile. She wore mirrored sunglasses, even though the sky had begun to dim, and her posture was rigid with a theatrical authority, one cultivated by years of unchecked power and suburban pettiness. Behind her lumbered two men in navy blue polos tucked into khakis, their bellies stretching fabric, their faux leather belts holding dollar store batons. "This gathering violates Section 4.3 of HOA Code," she barked, raising her clipboard like it was a badge. "No crowding near common roadways." The words sliced through the grief like a cold blade. People stared in stunned disbelief. It wasn't just the timing. It was the inhumanity of it. My wife blinked, as if trying to make sense of what she was hearing. Her father had served 2 tours overseas, survived ambushes and shrapnel, only to have his memorial marred by someone citing HOA regulations. Karen wasn't finished. "Disperse immediately or be cited," she added, eyes scanning the mourners like a predator assessing livestock. That's when it happened. One of the men moved forward fast. Before anyone could react, he reached out and grabbed my wife's arm, tight, like she was trespassing, like she was a threat. And just like that, our mourning turned into something else entirely. My wife's voice cracked beneath the weight of grief, brittle and trembling. "You can't do this," she pleaded, trying to wrench her arm free from the brute's grip. Her other hand still clutched the burial program, now crumpled, damp with her tears. The man holding her, thick-necked, eyes vacant with self-righteous delusion, tightened his grasp and snarled, "We have authority. We're enforcing HOA safety mandates." Mandates. That word hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. It wasn't just tone-deaf. It was obscene. Karen didn't flinch. She stood a few paces back, arms folded across her pressed beige cardigan, chin tilted upward like a monarch surveying peasants. Her lips curled into something grotesque, half smile, half sneer. She didn't need to lift a finger. Her officers were performing perfectly, pantomiming control in front of the stunned crowd. Their polyester uniforms clung to their frames like costumes on actors who didn't understand the roles they were trying to play. Someone in the back fumbled with a phone. Another raised theirs, recording. "Recording HOA enforcement is not permitted without authorization," Karen snapped, her voice rising with theatrical sharpness. "You are violating privacy policy and will be fined accordingly." She gestured toward one of her goons, who began marching toward a woman holding her phone. The mourners stiffened, torn between fear and indignation. I saw red. I stepped forward, fast, my pulse thudding with a ferocity that nearly drowned out the voices around me. Karen intercepted me, her body angled to block mine, like a bouncer at the gates of some twisted little kingdom. She raised a laminated HOA ID badge, holding it inches from my face as if it meant something. "Sir," she said, cool and smug, "do not interfere. You are currently trespassing on HOA-managed land." I looked past her. This wasn't HOA land. It was the parking lot of a church funded by community donations, maintained by a trust and recognized by the state as separate from residential oversight. But Karen didn't care. Jurisdiction wasn't the point. Power was. In that moment, with my wife still struggling against the grip of a man pretending to be something he wasn't, with the crowd frozen between grief and outrage, and with Karen standing like some tyrant draped in administrative theater, something inside me shifted. I had spent months, years, trying to avoid conflict, living quietly, mindfully. But the line had been crossed, not in pencil but in ink, thick, dark, and permanent. And for the first time that day, my grief gave way to something else entirely. Resolve. Karen Winters didn't just enforce the rules. She breathed them, weaponized them, twisted them into tools of control. She'd spent years climbing the HOA ladder, one petty grievance at a time, transforming from a nosy neighbor with a clipboard into a suburban despot with unchecked authority. Her rise wasn't built on competence or community trust. It was built on fear, loopholes, and the cowardice of people too tired or too polite to push back. She policed lawn heights with a ruler, banned garden gnomes for being aesthetic pollutants, and once fined a veteran for flying his American flag on a day that wasn't federally designated. The stories circulated in whispers, quiet conversations at backyard barbecues, hushed muttering outside mailbox clusters. She shut down a 6-year-old's birthday party over unapproved inflatables, citing unauthorized event permits. That father still avoided her street. But the crown jewel of her rule was her so-called HOA Security Division, a name she printed on a few vests and slapped onto a Craigslist-bought golf cart. The unit was a joke to anyone with a functioning frontal lobe, but in a neighborhood where silence had become survival, even jokes could cast long shadows. Her brother, Jimmy, a man who hadn't held a job in over a decade and spent most mornings shirtless in a lawn chair, became the sergeant. His partner, Dale, was a former minor league umpire with a temper and 2 DUIs. Together, they were Karen's enforcers. Nobody liked it, but nobody wanted to escalate. That was her brilliance, tyranny by attrition. Wear people down, one passive-aggressive warning letter at a time. Let fear of retribution do the heavy lifting. And for a while, I played along. We moved here 3 years ago. I paid my dues, mowed my lawn, kept my porch lights white and my garbage cans hidden. When she left notes about parking angles or holiday decorations, I gritted my teeth and complied. I didn't want attention. I didn't want conflict. I wanted quiet. That's why I never told anyone what I did for a living. No plaques on the wall, no discussions at the HOA meetings, just another face in the crowd. But that mask shattered the moment her goons laid hands on my wife, on the day of her father's funeral, in front of our neighbors, in front of God. That wasn't an overstep. It was an act of war. And Karen, for all her rules and threats and plastic badges, had no idea who she'd just declared it on. The morning air was crisp, sharp with purpose. There was no hesitation in my steps as I walked through the HOA building's glass doors, flanked by 2 state-certified agents in full uniform. The scent of lemon cleaner mixed with stale coffee clung to the carpeted halls. Fake civility wrapped around everything like cheap wrapping paper. Clean surfaces, organized file cabinets, that smugly curated community board on the wall plastered with outdated flyers. But underneath it all was the rot. The kind of rot that wears a name tag and carries a clipboard. Karen was already mid-tirade when we found her. She stood in the courtyard, wagging a finger at a bewildered landscaper who looked like he just wanted to finish his Tuesday. I said cedar mulch, not cypress. Cedar was specified in the quarterly maintenance memo. Do you even read the landscaping ordinances? Her voice was shrill, high-pitched with manufactured authority, the cadence of someone who had convinced herself that bullying was leadership. I let the moment hang just long enough for her words to echo off the building walls. Karen Winters? I asked, my voice loud and unmistakably official. She turned with visible irritation, already preparing whatever condescending line she reserved for residents she hadn't yet bullied into compliance. But when her eyes landed on the badge clipped to my breast pocket, her expression cracked. First confusion, then disbelief, and finally, unmistakable fear. I'm Daniel Cooper, I said, stepping forward, my tone flat, legal, and deliberate. State Prosecutor. You assaulted my wife yesterday, on church property, using 2 civilians impersonating police officers. The words hit like a gavel. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. One of the agents stepped forward, handing her a thick envelope, the seal of the state's Attorney General's office stamped clearly on the front. You're under formal investigation, he said, voice clipped and precise. Charges include impersonation of law enforcement, unlawful detainment, abuse of power, and targeted harassment. Her hand trembled as she took the document. For a moment, she didn't look like Karen the tyrant, just Karen the fraud. The HOA queen reduced to a civilian with no shield to hide behind. The landscaper she'd berated stood frozen. So did the receptionist watching from inside. No one moved. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was righteous. She had ruled through fear. Now she was learning what real authority looked like. Justice doesn't always come in a blaze of glory. Sometimes it arrives slowly, methodically, tearing down a facade brick by brick until nothing is left but truth, stripped bare and blinking in the light. That's exactly what happened to Karen Winters. The so-called HOA officers were cuffed before sunset the same day, led from their homes in embarrassment. The arrests weren't dramatic, just quiet, procedural, efficient. But the neighborhood watched, curtains shifted, cameras rolled, and for the first time in years, the only uniform that mattered was worn by someone who actually had authority. Karen, predictably, tried to vanish in the chaos, claimed she had emergency HOA business in the next county, an absurd deflection meant to buy time. She barely made it past the freeway ramp before a marked cruiser pulled her over. The excuse didn't hold up, neither did she. Then came the hearing. The room was packed, not just with lawyers and investigators, but with residents, faces etched with years of silent compliance, now emboldened by the chance to speak. They didn't come for spectacle. They came for vindication. The state presented the findings with surgical precision. Financial records, internal emails, and years of HOA meeting transcripts painted a damning picture. Karen had been running the association like a personal fiefdom. Nearly $130,000 in collected fines, some as petty as $25 for excessive seasonal decor, had been redirected into vague security preparedness initiatives. One line item simply read, Tactical uniforms, embroidery and fitting, $1,170. Another, Emergency vehicle enhancement, $9,483.22. Her tricked-out golf cart, complete with lights, PA system, and cup holders. But it wasn't just the money. Neighbors stepped forward with stories that, until now, had only lived in kitchen whispers and group chats. A single mother fined $400 for a chalk drawing on her sidewalk. An elderly veteran cited for lawn inconsistency after cancer treatments delayed his mowing. The blue wreath incident, A family punished for hanging a memorial decoration because it violated neutral tone standards. One by one, the board members resigned, each trying to distance themselves from the collapse. But they were all complicit, and the fallout spared no one. Karen was removed from her position immediately. A formal declaration followed. She was barred from serving on any neighborhood board within the state, fined $48,000 in restitution, and publicly censured in the final hearing minutes. No applause followed the announcement, just a silence far more powerful. The tyrant had fallen, not with a scream, but with the quiet sound of accountability finally catching up. Power, when unchecked, tends to rot in silence. It seeps into places it doesn't belong, front lawns, flower beds, funeral services, and disguises itself as order, community, safety. But the truth is, real justice isn't loud. It doesn't scream behind clipboards or parade around on golf carts with flashing lights. Justice doesn't need theatrics. It just is. That's why I never led with my title. I've prosecuted men who thought rules were for other people. I've seen what happens when power is abused, when authority becomes a performance instead of a duty. But I never expected to find that same pathology hiding in a gated suburb, wrapped in HOA stationery and petty vendettas. When the dust settled, when the charges were filed and the facade stripped bare, my wife and I returned to where it all began. The church sat in golden silence beneath the oaks, the air still, the grass freshly cut. No patrols, no warning signs, no ridiculous citations tucked beneath windshield wipers. Just calm. Just space to grieve. We held a second ceremony, not for formality, but for healing. There were no speeches, just quiet music, a few words shared by friends, and a worn photo of her father in his service blues resting on the steps of the altar. My wife stood beside me, steadier this time. Her hands didn't shake. She finally had the space to mourn without fear of interruption, without the indignity of bureaucracy barging in. Neighbors came. Some we barely knew. Most brought flowers, others just stood in silence. A few choked out apologies, guilt wrapped in phrases like, "We didn't know how to stop her," and "She made us feel powerless." I didn't hold grudges. Not that day. Afterward, we got to work. The HOA was rebuilt from the foundation up. The old bylaws were shredded, rewritten in plain language with clear limits and community oversight. We opened the board to real people, those who knew what it meant to serve without ego. A retired Marine, a single mom who juggled 2 jobs, a local science teacher who ran an after-school robotics club. People who understood compassion and responsibility. And Karen? She packed up 3 weeks later. No farewell, no apology, just a moving truck and a for sale sign. Her house went to auction. The landscaper, the same man she berated over mulch, snapped it up. He covered the entire front bed in bright red mulch. No warning letters arrived, no fines, no citations, only silence, and the quiet satisfaction of a community finally free.